Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Inside the Therapy Room. I'm your host, Sam Sellers. I'm a registered therapist, a wife and a fur mama, and I'm passionate about breaking down the barriers and stigma attached to therapy. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. Today, Fiona is on the land of the Bilyar people, and Sam is on Gundungurra land. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations people. We must always remember that the land below our feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today I am chatting to Fiona Rogerson. Fiona is a highly experienced and compassionate registered perinatal and trauma counsellor. Specialising in trauma recovery, particularly in the realms of birth, perinatal, and medical trauma. As an EMDR therapist, she offers evidence-based treatment to empower individuals, both consumers and health professionals, to heal from trauma. In her role as the principal counsellor at her perinatal and trauma group counselling practice, Fiona leads a dedicated team in providing supportive individual and couples therapy to help clients resolve their trauma, build resilience, and move forward. Additionally, as a clinical supervisor, she offers mentorship to emerging therapists and clinicians, and as a passionate trauma educator, she leads workshops and training to raise awareness about trauma and its effects. Her mission is to create systemic impact for those who experience trauma at the hands of our maternity system. Today's episode is about Fiona's incredible work with those who have experienced perinatal or birth trauma. We hope you enjoy joining us inside the therapy room. Welcome, Fiona. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for asking me to come in. I'm so excited.
I am excited about this episode because even I don't know a lot about it. So I think this is going to be, and it's probably something that I would imagine would be happening a lot, and people are probably not even aware that it's happening. So your specialty is around perinatal and birth trauma. So let's start with, what is that?
Yeah, good question. So I guess most of us have a good idea of what trauma is.
Mm-hmm.
When we're talking about perinatal and birth trauma, it's any trauma that kind of happens within that perinatal period, whether it's conception journey right through to, having young children. So it's trauma that might involve, as I said, the conception journey itself, pregnancy loss, birth trauma, which is trauma that happens in the birth space, even post-birth trauma as well, right up until, you've got breastfeeding trauma, the whole works. So it can be anything kind of within that span.
Okay. And so what led you to be passionate about this area?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try and condense it.
Yeah.
So for myself, after I had my first baby, I kind of fell into photography naturally. And I had a studio. I had a photography studio that I worked in, ran from home, wildly successful. And in that journey of having that studio, having a newborn, it was tough. We then entered a conception journey of our own to try and have a second child, which ended up taking 5 years. And within that journey, we had multiple pregnancy losses. We ended up going down the IVF route, so many failed IVF attempts. So it was quite a journey to be on, while I was a photographer who specialised in birth and newborn photography. So it was a really hard journey for me to kind of hold those both together. We were blessed with our second, and then with a third. Neither of them needed the IVF in the end. But it was after I had my third that I guess the cracks started to appear. I was really struggling with that. So it kind of all came to a head when I had been looking for something else career-wise. So I went over and saw a career coach, and she was incredible. So I had an appointment with her, sat down with her, and it was in the meeting with her that she actually looked at me and she said, I don't think I can help you. I don't think we can continue this conversation because I think there's something else going on here. And when I kind of spoke to her about what she was noticing, she was just noticing that I was quite vague. I couldn't kind of get my thoughts together. A whole lot of things that weren't really apparent for me.
Yeah.
So she recommended I go home and have a chat to my husband. So I did, and he kind of affirmed what she was saying. Uh, Long story short, I ended up going and seeing a counsellor myself.
Mm.
Uh, she identified what was going on for me, and I worked through a lot with her in terms of the trauma that I'd experienced from my first birth. It was now 7 years later, after my third, that we were working through that. So it was in working with her that I decided, well, I've got lots of experience in this space. Maybe I can do this too. So I went back to uni and I got my counselling degree. And then I guess the rest is history, moved into that space. So while I was studying, I became a birth doula. So I was supporting mums in the birth space. I became a childbirth educator. So I was teaching classes. And that's just all really informed where I am now.
Wow, what a journey.
Mm, yeah,
Goodness.
it's been a ride.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we think about, I guess, birth trauma, because I think, you hear people say, birth is the most natural thing in the world, right? How can
Mm.
that be traumatic? And so what does birth trauma look like? What would that actually be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have an assumption that a traumatic birth has to look a certain way.
Yeah.
So maybe it's a birth that didn't go according to plan, or a birth that ended in a cesarean. Whereas it's actually quite different to that. It's like any experience where you're not fully supported, where there was an element of threat, either to life or sense of self, and that can look like many different forms when it comes to birth trauma. So you can have a textbook unicorn home
Mm,
birth with all the lights in a birth pool and still feel traumatized by it if the support wasn't there, if there wasn't any threat to yourself or your baby.
mm.
There's really no identifying features of a birth that say this birth should have been traumatic and this birth shouldn't have been traumatic.
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
guess, I mean, so like we obviously know that circles back to the fact that what is traumatic for one person is not traumatic for somebody else,
absolutely.
and things like that. What period, if we often think, I guess, perinatal is pre-birth, but is it as
Mm.
clear cut as that? Because my understanding is it is a little bit on the other side of birth also.
Yeah, well, you'd get perinatal,
Yeah.
which covers the whole span. So
Okay.
it's, anything in that conception journey, and it runs right up through postpartum, which is, a woman forever after she's birthed
Yeah.
is postpartum. But it runs that whole kind of span of what happens before, what happens during, what happens after as well.
Okay. And so where is the line, I guess, between what would be considered postnatal depression versus what would be considered perinatal trauma?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that there's a lot of overlap in terms of symptoms of both. And I think that more often than not, um, the most recognized avenue for support for women is, let's go back to your GP.
Yeah.
And that's the first port of call, where most GPs aren't aware of trauma and they
Mm.
don't know how to work with it. So,
Yeah.
because a lot of those symptoms overlap, we have a lot of women that will be misdiagnosed with
Mm.
depression.
Yeah.
When if we look at it, it's trauma. It's a trauma response. Same with anxiety, the
Yeah.
postnatal anxiety. We're talking about a trauma response. When the body has just been through so much.
Mm.
Uh, but yeah, heavily misdiagnosed, and more often than not, if we resolve the trauma, then those symptoms that are classified as depression or anxiety, they resolve too.
Okay. Yeah. And so if we think of symptoms, what would people be looking for? What
When
does
it
that
comes to
look like?
trauma,
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it depends on what we're talking about because um, you can have a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, which covers, the four categories of symptoms and a certain presentation and a certain period of presenting with those symptoms, and then you
Yeah.
get your clinical diagnosis. But we also have, um, some women that are experiencing one or a couple of
Mm.
those symptoms, and they're ongoing and they're relentless, and they don't clinically fit a diagnosis of PTSD or trauma.
Yeah.
So we know that um, 1 in 3 women will experience birth trauma,
Mm.
and we know out of those women that do report it, only 1 to 2% of those will have that clinical PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah.
But from working with these women, we know that the signs and the symptoms are definitely there. They just don't fall into that clinical category.
Mm. And are there particular presentations that are specific to perinatal or birth trauma that might be a little bit different to, trauma from a car accident or, abuse or something like that?
I think it's the same. It's just applied to different situations. We're still talking about the impact on behaviors, the impact on relationships. The relationship might be, well, more often than not, is mother and child as
Yeah.
well. Um, the functioning every day in the way that they think about themselves and the world around them. Often you have some really common themes that will flow through with birth trauma in terms of um, sense of self, like I can't trust myself.
Yeah.
Themes around I'm not in control,
Mm.
or I'm helpless, or I'm powerless. That
Yeah.
comes through a lot. So I think it's the same. Trauma is trauma. It's just it looks different because it's a different situation.
Mm. What about for the partners? So the people who are non-birthing, is there perinatal trauma there?
Absolutely. And I think that, again, it goes back to what trauma is. You don't have to have experienced it yourself. You
Yeah.
can witness it happening to someone in front of you, and it can still be the threat to your nervous system.
Yeah.
So, particularly when it's a loved one,
Hmm.
so a partner, witnessing something happen to their partner or to their child, whether it's unborn or born.
Yeah.
If there is a threat to those people in their lives, then yeah, a partner will experience trauma as well.
Yeah. And so if people are concerned about their loved ones or they might be concerned for themselves, what sort of things should people look out for?
Changes in behaviour,
Okay.
the things that are really a part of who that person is, changes in ways of thinking, um, changes in the relationship dynamic. I think that most people know when something's not quite the same with their partner.
Yeah.
Um, but of course, it presents really with a challenge when we have exhaustion and we have parenting on top of that, and
Yeah.
we have our own childhood trauma is most likely to present when we become parents as well. So there's a lot of different factors involved. It becomes really challenging.
Yeah, at what point I'm thinking, particularly first-time parents,
Mm.
so many changes, so many, new relationship dynamics between the parents. At what point does it, is it just new parent exhaustion and change? At what point does that become trauma for them?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's impossible to know. I'm a huge advocate for it. You can just ask for help at any point.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you don't have to wait till this is trauma or
yeah,
this is depression. If something feels hard, then we can access our village, and our village doesn't have to be, the stereotypical long-term friends or close family. It can be those paid services.
yeah, yeah.
So if it feels hard, then access who you need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, podcast is called Inside the Therapy Room, right? So,
Mm.
what is it like for people to access support around this particular type of trauma? What does that look
Yeah,
like in the room?
I think it can look really different depending on the type of support that
Mhm.
they access, and also different depending on the type of trauma that they've had.
Mm.
So it's 67% of women that have experienced perinatal trauma will attribute the cause of that trauma to
Mm.
be at the hands of their caregivers.
Okay.
So it's not about whether they had a cesarean or whether they had a vaginal birth.
Mm.
It's the interactions with the people around them, how they were supported and how they were cared for.
Yeah.
So if that is true for a woman, then she might find it hard to find trust in the medical system again.
Mm.
That can prevent them from seeking help, but it can also change the type of help that they do seek out.
Yeah.
In my practice, we don't work within the medical model, so we don't have clients needing to go back into that system of care in order to work with us. So they can come straight to us. And I think it's a different experience than having to re-enter that
Yeah.
model of care again.
Mm.
So with us, um, it's very relational
Mm.
in terms of what it's like for them to come into our therapy room. We are human, just like them, and we let them know.
Yeah.
And there is no pressure. There is no diagnosis. There
Mm.
is no risk if their biggest fear is coming through that if I say I need help, someone's going to take my baby away from me.
Yeah.
So it's quite a safe space for them.
Mm. Is that a quite a common fear that people would have in seeking help?
Absolutely, that somebody's going to take my baby away.
Yeah.
They're going to think that there's something wrong with me, that I'm not capable of taking care of myself or my child. So
Mm.
that prevents them from reaching out for support.
Yeah. Goodness. I mean, that's a heartbreaking thought, right? And it
Mm,
would, I could imagine it would be, a real reason for them to delay seeking help for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Um, Now I know that you have your own model of how you work. Is that right?
yeah,
Yeah, tell us a
yeah.
little bit about that.
Yeah, so I've developed a framework around the way that I work with my clients when it comes to the birth trauma space. We've developed a framework called RISE. So we really look at relationships, we look at gaining insight, we look at some strategy around what do we actually do about this. And then we look at how we help with expansion, how we help that individual to grow.
Mm.
So from even my own experience with therapy, not my first therapist that got me into this space, but one since her, um, I know that the solution focused CBT approach doesn't work in this space. So we really spend time first developing that relationship between our clients and us. We really focus on that heavily in terms of I know that, from feedback we receive, the space that we provide doesn't feel like other therapy spaces in terms of it just feels really accessible and safe.
Mm.
So that's our priority. And then we move to insight, where we're really, really creating connections between not just the birth and what's happening now, but also what's happened previous
Mhm.
to that individual. So we make a lot of connections between childhood and developmental trauma
Mhm.
and their birth experience as well, because we find a lot of those common themes of I don't have control, or I'm powerless, or I'm not good enough to birth this baby. They've been there before.
Yeah.
So we really work with that insight. Then we look at strategy in terms of I know what it's like to see a therapist and not know where it's leading, or
Mm.
not know what's happening, or not being able to see how is this going to get any better. So we are all for being able to figure out, well, what are we actually going to do here? What
Mm.
is what does it look like for us to get you to your goals? What's going to be involved? So we really work with that strategic piece with our clients, which I think is really helpful to have that transparency when it comes to trauma.
Yeah.
And then we work on expansion. What's it going to look like
Mm.
after we've resolved what we need to? What do you want next? How are we going to support you in getting back out there?
Mm.
So that's kind of our framework. That's how we work with all of our clients.
Yeah. I would imagine that strategy phase would also be really empowering for them, particularly if there is a loss of control or feeling like, that they don't have any sense of control, that would be a really empowering phase for them.
Absolutely. And when you look at, those themes of, like you said, loss of control, I'm not good enough, when we look at, the relationship ruptures
Mm,
from caregivers previously, being able to be really fully transparent with, this is how we're going to help you, this is what it's going to look like, this is what it's going to take from you, this is what you're going to get from us, and we're not going to leave,
mm,
and we're not going to walk away from this until you decide to walk away from it.
yeah.
Yeah,
Do
until you're
people,
ready to.
yeah, do people often come in thinking that it's just about the birth and it's just about the pregnancy, or
Everyone,
yeah, yeah.
everyone. Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So it is eye opening. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And I would imagine that insight phase could also be quite overwhelming. But it's like, to me, that sounds like the joining the dots part. It's like the red string in, like the imagery that's coming to mind is like in a crime show where they're like joining the dots,
yeah,
essentially. Yeah. And it's like,
absolutely.
where are the connections here?
Yeah, and it can feel overwhelming, but that's where that relationship, the first phase, is really important to
Yeah.
say, I've got your back the whole way through this.
Mm,
So lots of conversations around the grief that will open up when those connections are made. That's part of the work that we're going to be doing.
mm,
Um, and you do get some clients that aren't ready for that,
yeah.
aren't ready or willing or wanting to do that, and that's okay as well.
Mm, yeah. Now, I know that you do EMDR as well, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Yeah. And do you find that that's quite effective in this space?
Oh, it's incredibly effective in this space. It's
Mm.
probably something that we use with the majority of our clients.
Okay. Yeah. Why
Yeah,
do you find it so effective?
because it works.
That
Because it
is a
really
pretty
does
good
work.
reason. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a good
In
reason.
in the in the resolution of trauma,
Yeah.
it works.
Yeah.
Um, it's not often that it doesn't. We're not able to use it.
Mm,
I think it offers a lot. I think for the clients that need it, it offers that stability in terms of it can be quite structured if it needs to be for
yeah.
that client, but it can also be quite fluid and organic if it needs to be as well.
Mhm.
Um, it feels like you're moving the needle forward. It's
Mm,
not just talk therapy.
yeah.
So it's actually, participation. But again, it's not that top down CBT approach. It works with the way that someone's thinking. It
Yeah.
works with the way that they're feeling. It works with the way that their body is holding that trauma as well. So
Yeah.
I think it just ticks all of the boxes in terms of what's important to me
Mm,
with how I want my practice to work.
yeah. And I mean, I've found I'm not EMDR trained, but I have had EMDR as a client. And so I find that the trauma clients who I see, often what delays them coming to therapy is feeling like they need to retell everything all the time, all over
Mm.
again. And that was the thing that I loved about EMDR, was that I knew that I didn't have to sit down and tell my story in complete detail. Um,
Yeah, it's not required.
yeah, yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
what does and I'm probably asking this thinking, it if we think about like pregnancy and birth, it's in the body and trauma is in the body. And so how does that present in a person's body?
I think that that's quite a big question. But
Mm.
when you look at that, it's, again, that thought that there is no such thing as a single incident trauma,
Yeah.
that it's often not about what physically happens to a woman in birth, it's about the relationships and the meaning that they've made from those relationships.
Mhm.
Um, then it becomes less about, in the body, it's not really birth related
Okay.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it becomes more about those themes previously that were held as a child and are developed over the years.
Yeah.
So things like I'm powerless, or I'm not in control, or I'm not good enough. or I'm not significant, I'm not important.
Mm,
They would have been there as a child.
okay.
Yeah. And they've just been like reignited in
Mm,
birth.
yeah.
So when we're talking about how it's held in the body, it's how those things are held in the body.
Mhm.
So yeah, different for each person.
Mm, yeah. And so what does that, and this is, and I know that as I am about to say this question, that it is because I would give the answer of it looks different for everybody. So I'm very aware.
Mm,
But I'm aware that, some of the people who will be listening are not practitioners, who are potentially people who are looking for support as well. What does that healing process look like?
with EMDR.
Just in general, just like what does that healing um, let's say birth trauma particularly, what does that look like for somebody if they're going, I've never been to therapy before. I don't know
Mm.
what I'm walking into. What does it actually look like?
Okay. Yeah. Great question.
And I know it's a
So
big question. I'm very well
it
aware.
is a big question. But I think that's where our framework comes in a lot in terms of
Yeah,
it provides that structure. Yeah.
yeah.
So when they come in to first see us, there are no set ways that it has to be done, but
Mm,
we do offer a structure for
yeah.
each and every session. We do offer guidance. Um, we are, I say we, because I'm talking about myself and my team, my counsellors. We're not passive in our approach. We're quite active
Mhm.
in the way that we work with our clients. So lots of conversation, lots of dialogue, direction if it's needed. But we spend time to figure out first and foremost what's currently happening for that person. So what made them decide to come to therapy? What's been the catalyst?
Yeah.
We spend time really figuring out, well, how are we going to know if
Mm,
this therapy is working?
mm,
What are our checkpoints? We want this to be something that has an endpoint and a goal that
mm,
can be achieved for them. So we spend time deciphering that. And then we look at, again, how are we going to get from where we are now
mm,
to that point? So we really lay out, this therapy might be amazing for you. And we don't always have that. We don't always have that clear structure, but it can still be like, let's spend the next couple of sessions
mm.
doing this.
Yeah.
Um, so everybody just feels that safety in
Mm,
knowing what's coming and feeling held in what's coming. But in terms of how the healing happens, we work with various different approaches that tie in really well with EMDR.
yeah.
So we work with, the somatics. We're quite strong with working with polyvagal theory. We teach, we work with a lot of parents as well. So we're working with expanding the windows of tolerance.
Mhm.
But we also go back into, we do a lot of ego states and parts work and working with those child parts as well. So
Mhm.
whatever works for that client,
Yeah.
we'll head down that route.
Yeah. I think it's a part of the reason why I started this podcast was because I wanted to reduce the need for people to therapist shop, essentially, to like
Mm,
find that person because it can be exhausting and it can often turn people off seeking help because, if they've had a bad experience or I still have, it blows my mind. I still have people come in who are surprised that I talk back to them, like because there is this idea that, gone are the days where therapists just sit there stone cold with no expression, right? My clients get
mm,
all of the expressions because, like you said, we are just as human as they are. But I think there is still this, I think, and it, TV and society probably perpetuates that, but I like when clients have an idea of what to expect. I think it eases some of that, particularly initial session anxiety that people will have.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
completely agree. And they need to know that you're human.
Yeah.
They need to know that they can relate to whoever's in front of them.
Absolutely. And I mean, I would imagine also, particularly in this space, there would be at times quite a lot of medical stuff, medical jargon, and things like that that's used. I know for myself, when I work with religious trauma clients, that I never want them to educate me on things. And
Mm.
so, um, is there an ease about your clients knowing that this is not just something that you know about, but something that you experienced also?
Oh, absolutely. I think there is so much comfort in that. I
Mm.
think that there is also added comfort in that not only have I experienced birth, but I've also worked in the birth space.
Yeah.
And I continue to work alongside other perinatal professionals. So in my practice, we do a lot of education and training for midwifery groups. I've done for hospitals. I regularly teach in Australian Doula Academy each year, every time they have a training. So we really feel like we have our finger on the pulse in what's going on in the medical midwifery maternity system.
Yeah.
I make sure all of the people that work with me are really up to date, even just with the physiology of birth.
Mm.
So you're right, they don't have to educate any of us. They don't have to come in and explain to us, what a cervical lip is. Like we know that.
Mm.
They can just talk to us about their experience.
Yeah.
Um, they can mention anything, and we know what they're talking about. So
Yeah.
I think that has an element of safety with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there are certain areas where I feel like lived experience can be really powerful. And so I would imagine that, even just the little bit of the story that you have on your website would be a comfort for a lot of people to know that this is not just something that you have learnt about, but it's something that you
Mm.
experienced as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a mother of three. I've
Yeah.
had three of my own births. We've been through pregnancy loss. We've been through IVF. We've been through weaning trauma. We've been through it. So hopefully that provides some comfort to the clients that we see.
Yeah, absolutely. What's something that people might not know about birth trauma?
I think the number one, oh, I think there's so many. I think that the overlap that we talked about with postnatal depression is a huge one that a
Yeah.
lot of women don't know. I think that's really important as well because I think that it really, not having the understanding can narrow the options that
Mm.
women have. I think it's also important to understand how birth trauma can impact partners and relationships, which is something that a lot of people aren't aware of or don't consider. And I think it's also important to know, that childhood trauma will come back and
Mm.
raise its head at
Yeah.
this point as well. So even if things feel tough and there was no trauma that a woman feels around her birth, um, it can be the smallest experiences in that birth that have just compounded things that were already there.
Yeah.
So I think that those are probably the three things that I think most don't consider that are really important to be aware of.
Yeah. And so I guess, with that postnatal depression, is it still, I mean, this is obviously not the space that I work in. I work in religious trauma. This is not what, and so, but my assumption is that with postnatal depression, particularly if you would go to your GP about it, it's a very medical based healing. And I say that in inverted commas because I'm assuming it's medication based.
Mm.
Would that be
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
And
Yeah.
and medication does not heal trauma.
No, it does
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that it can mask
Yeah.
trauma a lot of the times, that medication.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that I'm anti-medication. I
Yeah,
think it
no.
absolutely has its place. And there have been many clients of ours that we will say, let's work alongside a GP and hit this from many angles.
Mm.
Um, But yeah, I think it's got its place, but it's also wildly
Mm.
misdiagnosed as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so do you find that there is, does it have to, not have to, does it often happen for first-time parents, or do you see it happen on a second, third, fourth baby, where the trauma, it might come as a surprise to the person because, they've had a baby before, nothing, everything went fine, they were fine afterwards. Do you find that people are surprised that it might have
I
come?
think so.
Yeah,
Yeah, first baby. Um, I think the awareness that that wasn't what I expected. But I
yeah,
think that for many women, there's also then the acceptance of, or the misunderstanding that's put out by society that a lot of what they experience post that traumatic birth is just part and parcel of motherhood,
yeah,
right? So, of course, you're going to be feeling that anxious about leaving your baby when, a mother avoids leaving her baby with anyone for any reason. And
yeah.
we pass that off as, of course, that's normal. Of
Mm,
course, it's normal to do this. Of course, it's normal to do that. And because of that, second baby comes and it can be just as traumatic. But
mm,
again, it's just swept under the rug as that's what that's what it is.
yeah,
I think until there's a healing from that first birth
mm,
and actively acknowledging that that was trauma, then I think that's when there can be change for what happens after with subsequent births.
yeah.
Mm.
I'm gonna throw a curveball, but you're a pro, so no, you'll be fine. Um, what do other therapists need to know about this space?
That's a really good question. I don't know exactly how other therapists work with it, but I think that my top tips would be to get your jargon
Mm,
like sorted, get a better understanding of the clinical side of birth,
yeah.
um, get a better understanding of complex trauma
Mm,
and chronic trauma because birth is often not just about birth.
yeah,
Um, and just relate really well and create safety
yeah.
because after an experience of birth trauma,
Mm,
safety has been a rug that's just been pulled out.
yeah.
So really focus on that and stop saying at least your baby's here
Mm,
because I know therapists that have said that as well. It's
yeah.
time to move on.
Yeah.
It's
I
over
mean,
now.
I think even like I hear that a lot with pregnancy loss. Like my wife had an ectopic pregnancy that ruptured, and there were a couple of people who, at least she can get pregnant, and you go, oh, that's like so not the point. Like, that's so not the point. And it's so unhelpful, right? It's
Yeah,
just
it's
so
damaging.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I
Um,
think that there just needs to be. I think it's okay to say I want to work with this population, but you really need to understand what you're working with.
yeah. Is there particular training around this that people can access?
No, there
Hmm.
is not. So it's been a real compilation of finding the
Yeah.
trainings that fit.
Okay.
A lot of trainings around trauma in general, around complex trauma.
Yeah.
I provide a training to perinatal professionals in terms of teaching midwives and doulas and birth workers. This is what it looks like. This
Yeah.
is how you can work with it within the scope of your role. This is
Yeah.
how you can stop causing it as
Mm,
well.
yeah.
But in terms of a one-stop shop for working with it,
Mm.
there isn't, unfortunately.
So Fiona, when are you creating it? I feel like
One
that's the
day,
next job.
one day. Yeah, well, I have the
Oh,
supervision group, so I love that.
yeah, yeah,
Working with a lot of these therapists in supervision. I do a lot of business mentoring as well. So being able to help therapists to develop their
yeah,
practice into a way that can deeply serve.
yeah.
Um, So yeah, it's happening on the periphery at the moment.
It's bubbling on the
It's
surface.
bubbling. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that.
Okay. This is the point where I ask everybody, what myth do you want to smash about perinatal or birth trauma? What's important? What misconception really grinds your gears?
Probably the most simple one
Mhm.
is that birth trauma has to have occurred during labor and birth
Mhm.
when a baby is born
Mm.
if it ends in a cesarean. So I
Right.
know a lot of people think that no, you had a natural birth.
Mm.
Even that word, natural birth, is just
Yeah,
not,
it's a bit gross, right? Yeah.
it is a bit gross. But
Yeah.
just that myth that trauma can only occur in that instance where,
Mm.
you can have that unicorn birth and still be traumatized by it. And it's okay and it can get better. And it can happen at any point for any reason, and there's no definition as to what traumatizes someone.
Yeah.
So if it has for you, then it has for you.
Mm. Yeah. I think that's important. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I you see even just like posts and comments online and the way that it's spoken about and the way that you even see friends and family and that sort of thing speak online is that the only trauma is, an emergency cesarean where everything is like
Mm.
chaos and panic and everything is rushed, or, a breech birth, or, all of those things that you would probably see on the TV, in the
Mm.
medical shows. But the scope would be much bigger than that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I work with clients all the time where their trauma is in their pregnancy in terms of the care that they receive there, or the
Yeah.
trauma is in the separation that they've had with their baby post birth.
Mm,
So they felt that their baby's okay, like health wise, but the separation has caused the trauma. Um, so I think just being able to smash that myth.
mm.
And probably the other myth I would love to smash if I could fit two in
Yeah, absolutely.
is that it's all part and parcel of motherhood. Like trauma is just what has to happen in terms of your initiation into being a mum. Like
Yeah.
that's just so screwed.
Yeah.
Mm.
Actually, I'm going to throw another question at you, which is what do you say to there is and I don't know whether you have noticed this undercurrent on social media, but there is, I guess, this notion that because birth is so natural, that there are like holistic workers out there who some of their content is a little like victim blamey or, and so what are your thoughts about that?
I see it all the time.
Yeah.
And I see, the ideas around women need to advocate more, or they need to
Mm,
educate themselves more, or they need to be, you know, planning more, or they need to be planning less.
mm,
It doesn't come from what a woman does. It comes from trauma here. It comes from the level of threat
yeah,
that has been planted on them.
mm,
And that doesn't happen from whether a woman is advocating enough. If there is threat, there is threat.
yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a whole lot of
Rubbish.
yes. Trying to think of
Yeah.
a
Yeah, I
safe
know.
word there.
Yeah, and it's just all about the breathing patterns and, all of that sort of thing where it just sounds like, let's just put more onto the person who is giving birth. Um,
Yeah, let's.
let's just
They're responsible.
pile it on. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, but we can't place all the responsibility of
Yeah,
for trauma onto the woman who is birthing. Like
yeah,
our system needs to take some responsibility there, if not all of
absolutely.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the loved ones or the partner and, the support people, as
Mm.
well. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining me.
Pleasure. I love this conversation.
Yeah, it's been so good. I just think, when I reached out to you, I was like, I just think that this is not talked about enough. Like, I even found, when we had the pregnancy loss, that there is just not a lot of conversation around it. I think there's even less conversation around ectopic pregnancies. I think everything is very miscarriage centered. Um,
Mm.
but I think the more people that talk about it, and I think the more people that label it trauma, and it's not like um, it doesn't have to be a diagnosis, it doesn't have to be
Mm.
clinical. I think the more actual healing will happen, and
Yeah,
the
totally.
less victim blaming and the less masking, like you said. Um,
Yeah,
so, so
yeah,
thank you for the work that you do.
love it.
Yeah, yeah, I'm
Yeah,
so glad. Thank you.
pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed joining us inside the therapy room. Thanks for listening.